Salve or salvete. Today's video is going to cover relative pronouns. To give you an idea of what you should be able to take away from this video, let's take a look at this quote from Virgil's Georgics. The quote reads, "Felix qui rerum cognoscere causas," and is translated as, "Happy is he who is able to know the causes of things." By the end of this video, you should be able to recognize that qui is a relative pronoun, who is an acceptable translation for a relative pronoun, and the who is acting as a flag referring to the he in the phrase happy is he. And the he that the who is referring to is termed the antecedent. But without further ado, let's define what relative pronouns are. So, what are relative pronouns? To start, let's take a look at these two sentences. I see the country house. The country house is beautiful. While it is grammatically correct to have these two sentences separated and have them as two, it's clunky and cumbersome when you read it. It's, I see the country house. Pause. The country house is beautiful. And so what we can do instead is we can add a bridge, quote unquote, and make these two sentences into one. That bridge is the word which, and now those two sentences are one with this one sentence. I see the country house, which is beautiful. Since these two sentences are both talking about the same thing, country houses, I don't really have to repeat it. I can just have this flag, this which, and we know that it will refer back to country houses, and then just add on more information about it without having to separate it out into a different sentence. That's all the which is doing. The which is acting as a flag referring back to the noun, country house, and just adding more information onto that noun without repeating the noun itself. And which is a relative pronoun. That bridge is a relative pronoun. To give a formal definition, relative pronouns are words like who, what, that, whom, and whose, and also which, that can join two sentences together which talk about the same person or thing. To really drive this home, let's just take a look at these two sentences again. They both talk about country houses in some way, shape, or form. The first sentence, it's the direct object. The second sentence, it's the subject. So we can insert a relative pronoun, act as that flag, so we can add more information onto that noun without ever having to repeat it. To continue our definition of what relative pronouns are, let's take a look at what they are not. Relative pronouns are not adjectives. If you've never seen that symbol before, the exclamation point equals is and not. Shout out to all my CS nerds out there. Here's why they are different. Adjectives agree with what they modify in gender, number, and case. Pronouns, on the other hand, and this definition is a little bit off, so just bear with me. It's sort of been what we've talked about so far. Relative pronouns, they act as flags, which are merely just placeholders for noun. They don't necessarily modify anything. They're not adding any more information. The relative clause might be adding more information, but the pronoun itself is not adding any information. And thus, they don't modify. When they are translated into Latin, however, relative pronouns will inherit some of the characteristics of the noun that it is acting as the flag for. It will only inherit two of those characteristics, gender and number. It will not inherit the case of the noun that it is referring to. If you take one thing away from this video, I want it to be that relative pronouns do not take the case of the noun that they are referring to, only the gender and the number. There are certainly times when the two will be the same, but they just don't, it's not a rule that they always do it. Only gender and number the relative pronouns take, not the case. And I really just want to drive that point home. The case of the relative pronoun will be dependent on its use within the relative clause. This was why it's different from adjectives. Adjectives are stuff like the happy sailor, lightus nauta. they're modifying each other. They have to go with each other. But the relative pronoun is acting as a flag, and it's just referring back to that noun. It's not directly modifying it. So I can move it around within the relative clause depending on how it's used. And you'll see more examples of how it's used in a bit. So now let's define a little bit more terminology surrounding relative pronouns. We'll take a look at the sentence that we have created. I saw the country house, which was beautiful. The first term that I'm going to define is the relative clause. The relative clause is the clause which includes the relative pronoun. Go figure. In this sentence, that is the which was beautiful. This is a type of dependent clause. We know it is a type of dependent clause because if we just had which was beautiful on its own, it couldn't stand. It couldn't stand because there's not a subject and a verb and an object. So if we took that out of the sentence, then I saw the country house could stand on its own, but since it's added in there with the relative pronoun, it is a relative clause and it is dependent. It needs an independent clause to stand on its own. And so the next thing that we're going to define is the antecedent, and this is sort of what I've been referring to. That is the noun that the relative pronoun is referring back to. That is the noun from which you only inherit the gender and number from, and not the case. And so yeah, antecedent, that's the true noun that the relative pronoun is acting as a flag for. And so the next thing that I want to do is talk a little bit more about determining the case of the relative pronoun. If we take a look at the sentence, which was beautiful, we can rewrite that sentence as the country house was beautiful, because remember, the relative pronoun is only a flag. I can replace that with the noun itself. We just don't have that because we've just decided that which is how we're going to add the word which in there to bridge the two sentences together. So if we were to write the sentence with its true subject, it would be the country house was beautiful. And in this sentence, the country house, that's the subject. And since it is the subject, there is only one use for a subject, and that is, or there's only one case for the subject use, and that is the nominative. I say that in 95% of the sentences, it'll be the nominative subject. You will learn later in Latin too something called an indirect statement, in which there are accusative subjects, but that will be very easy to spot on its own. But don't worry about that one for right now. Since it's the subject of the sentence, it will be in the nominative case. So now that we have an introduction to what relative pronouns are, let's go ahead and decline them. Because, as we sort of alluded to, there will be different genders of the relative pronoun. There will be different numbers, singular versus plural, of the relative pronoun. Both of those two factors depending on the antecedent. And there will be different cases because, also as we said, the relative pronoun merely acts as a flag. It's being a placeholder for an actual noun, and so, as we know, nouns can go into different cases, so the relative pronoun can go into different cases based on how it's used in the sentence. And so, let's go through these forms, and let's go through some acceptable translations. So, first, for nominative singular, it goes qui, quae, quod, for masculine, feminine, and neuter. And you can translate this as who, which, or that. In the genitive, in all three forms, it will be cuius. You can translate the genitive relative pronoun as whose or of which / that. A note to any Cortana players out there, a question that is commonly asked is what form of the relative pronoun is needed in the following sentence, and then they will give some sentence, they'll give an antecedent and then some English definition. And so if you hear something like Cornelia, whose father, you buzz in right there and say either cuius or the plural form, depending on whether or not the antecedent is singular or plural. But if you hear whose, that is a dead giveaway that they want something in the genitive. Moving into the dative, it's cui in all three forms. And I want to take a second and look at this IUS and I pattern. This looks very similar to hic and ille. Both of them have an IUS in the genitive and dative singular. And just patterns like that, that's something that's really good to take note of. This also is the same with isea id. Isea id, its genitive singular is eus, and its dative singular is ei. And so with different relative pronouns, different demonstrative adjectives, that IUS and I in the genitive, that IUS in the genitive and that I in the dative is very common. An acceptable dative translation is to whom, to which, or to that. Also for whom, for which, and for that. I forgot to add it on this one, but I think in the ablative it'll pop in as a acceptable translation. Moving into the accusative, it is quem in the accusative singular, quam in the accusative singular feminine, and quod, because neuter rule, nominative and accusative are the same in the neuter. Acceptable translations for this are whom, which, and that. So here we have to make an important distinction between who and whom. If the relative pronoun is the subject, then we can use who. If the relative pronoun is the object of the verb within that relative clause, then we have to use whom, considering that it is a person that we are referring to. You cannot use whom for a nominative translation, and you cannot use who for an accusative translation. Which and that are interchangeable, and those are normally used to refer to inanimate objects. But when you're referring to people, who is nominative, whom is accusative. And really, whom is everything else but nominative. So you'll also see whom show up in dative, genitive, and also ablative. You'll see in a second. The ablative forms are quo in the masculine, qua in the feminine, and quo in the neuter. And ablative, because we can translate ablative a million different ways, we can translate the ablative relative pronoun a million different ways. Either with or by whom, by which, by that, from whom, from which, from that. I can't remember if you can do it in whom, or in which, or in that for the relative pronoun. I think you can. I think I remember sometimes that I've translated it that way, but I think that's when you actually get to AP or Latin 3 when you get to actual classical authors. I don't think any textbook right now will have you translate a relative pronoun in which, but it's entirely possible. Moving into the plural. The plural here is qui, qui, quai for masculine, feminine, and neuter, respectively. So it's good to have these forms that are the same, but just remember, really pay attention to the antecedent and really pay attention to its gender and number and make sure that they both line up. Especially with quai being 3 different forms: feminine singular, feminine plural, and neuter plural. So there will be some times where you encounter forms that are ambiguous, but make sure you take a look at the antecedent to be 100% sure that, yes, this is definitely what it can be. And another pattern which comes up a lot in the different demonstrative adjectives and different pronouns is that the feminine nominative singular and the neuter nominative plural will be the same form. I know hic ille does this. I know isea id does this. So if you ever just absolutely blank on what the neuter nominative plural is, just remember it's the same as the feminine nominative singular, which is quai in this case. Another important thing to note: the translations don't necessarily change from singular to plural. By saying they don't necessarily change, they don't change. You still have your who, your whose, your to whom, your whom, and your by with, from, in. So the translations don't change based off of number, but they will change based on case. So make sure you know that you're working with the correct case and the correct translation for that case. The genitive plural is translated as quorum in the masculine, quarum in the feminine, and quorum in the neuter. So in the genitive plural, there will be different forms for different genders. In the genitive singular, the three forms will be the same. Dative, as per the status quo with nouns, this is going to be the dablative plural. So the dative and the ablative will be the same, and they will be the same for all three forms. So you have quibus, quibus, quibus going across. And then accusative plural is quos, quas, quae. Remember quae because, once again, the neuter rule, the nominative and the accusative have to be the same. It is very, very tempting to get into a pattern and say quibus, 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 quos, quas, quos, and no, that is wrong. But don't worry, I'm guilty of that too sometimes, so don't worry about it. But do know that it is quae for the accusative plural neuter, and the nominative plural neuter for that matter. And then, as I alluded to, dablative plural, dative and ablative are the same. It is quibus, quibus, quibus all the way across. So now we've defined what relative pronouns are. We've gone through the different forms of the relative pronoun. Now I'm going to walk through 4 sentences, 2 in English, 2 in Latin, to sort of show you how you should attack these sentences. And so we're going to start with the sentence we have talked about throughout the video. I saw the country house, which was beautiful. When you're working with a sentence going from English to Latin, or from Latin to English for that matter, first thing that you should do is underline the relative pronoun, if it has it, of course. You should underline that relative pronoun, write RP under it, so you know that's the relative pronoun. And then draw an arrow back to your antecedent and put a line under the antecedent and write antecedent. For English, this is a lot easier to do. Latin, there's still a couple other steps that you have to do first. You're essentially going to do what I'm about to say first and in reverse. But anyways, in English, the antecedent is almost all the time the noun that comes right before that relative pronoun. And so now we've identified the antecedent, we've identified the relative pronoun, and so the next thing I do is I draw a line right between the middle of the two, separating the independent clause from the relative clause. Everything to the left, I know that all I'm going to do is deal with gender number. Everything to the right, I know that's where I'm going to deal with case. I draw this line just so I don't get confused, that I don't accidentally put case, and I know that I'm working with 2 distinct parts of the sentence. And also, the first thing to do is I take a look at what the case will be. I do that first to get it out of the way, so I don't accidentally take the case from the antecedent. And so, the first one, which was beautiful, we've already sort of talked about this. Which is just a flag. You can insert the country house into there, and it would be the country house is beautiful, and the country house would then be the subject of that sentence. Therefore, within the relative clause is the subject, therefore, which is what those 3 dots are. When we translate it, we have to use a nominative form. Now we figured out what case that the relative pronoun is going to be in, and so we set that aside, knowing that we've already figured that out, so it doesn't matter what case the antecedent has to go into. We've already figured out what case the relative pronoun is going to into, so any other information about case is irrelevant. And now we figure out what the gender and the number of the antecedent is so that we can figure out the correct form of the relative pronoun. For country house, the Latin word for country house is villa. The gender of villa is feminine, and within the sentence, the number is singular. Notice how I don't even worry about the case or the correct form. So we know now that we know the gender of villa, we know the noun of the we know the gender of the antecedent, we know the number of the antecedent, and now we know the case. And we've already established what the case is going to be, so now we look for the correct form. The feminine singular nominative form of qui quae quod is quae. And we know now, when we translate it, there's going to have to be quae for the relative pronoun. Now, translating relative clauses into Latin, you can kind of throw it in wherever you want, as long as the relative pronoun starts it and a verb ends it. When I translate this one into Latin, I throw it at the end. You can throw it right next to the antecedent if you really wanted to, or where it logically mattered, but as long as the relative clauses are together and not broken up, it doesn't really matter where it goes. So you could translate this into Latin as ego, which is, of course, optional, velam, vidi, quae pulchra, or formosa, depending on which adjective you used, erat. Now let's take a look at our second sentence, which is marginally longer. The gladiator killed the lion with a sword, which the blacksmith had made. And so we're going to follow the same set of steps here. First thing we want to do is we want to identify the relative pronoun, which is which. We want to underline it and then draw that line, separating the relative clause from the independent clause. And then we also want to draw that arrow going from the relative pronoun to the antecedent so we know what the relative pronoun is being the flag for, what it is standing in the place of. Here it is standing in the place of a sword. And so we've separated the two clauses, we know what our relative pronoun is, we know what our antecedent is. Now we can identify what case the relative pronoun will be translated into. If we were to take the relative clause and turn it into an independent clause, just swapping out with which with sword, it would be the sword the blacksmith had made. In that sentence, the blacksmith is the subject. Going back to Latin 1 in subject, verb, object, the blacksmith is the subject who is verbing the object. The subject is verbing the object, the blacksmith is making the sword. Therefore, within the relative clause, which is the direct object. Even though it is not after the verb with this in English, it is the direct object of the sentence. Therefore, it is accusative because facere doesn't take anything other than the accusative case for the direct object. So now we have our case, and now all we have to worry about is gender number. So we go to the antecedent, which is sword, and the Latin word for sword, or one of the Latin words for sword, is gladius. And for the purposes of this, we're just going to go with gladius. If you wanted to spice things up and use ferrum, then you could, and that would be neuter. So just do everything that I'm doing, but replace masculine with neuter if you want to. So the gender of gladius is masculine, and in the sentence with the sword, it is singular. And so now we have our gender, masculine, our number, singular, and our case, accusative, and we take that information, we go to qui quae quod, and from that we come out with quem. Once again, if you use ferrum, it would be quod. That would be the form that you would get out of this, but we're just going to stick with quem for right now. So we've gotten our form quem. And then now that we have our relative pronoun, we can just translate this sentence. If, like I said earlier, if you wanted to, you can, when you translate this into the normal subject, object, verb form in Latin, you can put this relative clause right after the antecedent, or you could put it at the end of the sentence. As long as it is bracketed off by a proper relative pronoun and a verb, doesn't really matter a whole lot where you put it, so long as it is after the antecedent. And so this translated into Latin would be gladiator leonem, gladio necavit, quem habere facerat. And that works. Another way you could translate it would be gladiator leonem, gladio, quem habere facerat necavit. Either would be perfectly acceptable. So these are the two sentences. When you're going English to Latin, identify the relative pronoun, identify the antecedent, draw the line, figure out the case within the relative clause, then figure out gender, number of your antecedent, use those three pieces of information and get the correct form of qui quae quod, and then translate it normally. Now that we've gone English to Latin, let's go Latin to English. We are going to start with this first sentence here. Mox servi quorum dominus aberat ad urbem Romae fugient. As with what we did going from English to Latin, first thing that we want to do is identify the relative pronoun. The relative pronoun here is quorum. So we're going to underline that right away and say, all right, we've got our relative pronoun. The next thing we want to do is identify the relative clause. As we notice here, quorum is in the middle of this sentence. And so we need to find out where this relative clause starts and where this relative clause ends, because as we said, it can't stand on its own, so we know that there's going to be something else and there's going to be a bigger independent sentence. The relative clause is everything in between the relative pronoun and the first verb that you see after that relative pronoun. And so, quorum dominus haberat. Haberat is our first verb, and so that is our relative clause. Quorum to haberat. So we know that's its own certain thing, so we're going to bracket that off because that is special. That's its own separate world. Nothing from any other parts of the sentence can modify and agree with it. That does its own thing. And so it's not in brackets here until a little bit later, but that's the next thing that you should do. First, identify it, then bracket out your relative clause. The third thing that you should do is identify what your antecedent is. What you should do to do that is take a look at the relative pronoun and look at its gender and number. Take a look at quorum. Quorum is masculine. It is also in the plural. So we have to take a look at all the nouns before our relative pronoun to see which two fit that, or which noun or nouns fit that description. Lucky for us, there is only one noun before the antecedent, which is serve. So we can just say that our antecedent is serve and call it a day, and that does actually work. Serve is masculine and it is plural. 99% of the time, the relative pronoun that you run into, the antecedent will come before the relative pronoun. It is not until you get to actual authors, like I know Caesar does this a couple of times, where the antecedent is actually after the relative pronoun. But let me stress, as a Latin 2 student right now, or most likely you could be in Latin 1 or Latin 3 listening to this, your antecedents are going to come before your relative pronoun. It's not until you get to AP or 5 that you will see weird constructions like that. And even then, your book will make a note of it, or your teacher will point out, hey, the antecedent here is weird. So be wary of that. But right now, don't worry about that. Just have that in the back of your mind for when you get further up in your Latin scholarly studies. And so we've identified the relative pronoun, we've identified and bracketed our relative clause, we've identified our antecedent, and so the last thing that we have to do is worry about the case and how we're actually going to translate this relative pronoun. So we know that the relative pronoun is genitive. The case is genitive as denoted by the orem ending. And so we translate genitive relative pronouns when they're referring to actual people as of whom or whose. If it were an inanimate object, then you would say of which or of that. Either would work. But since these are actual people we're referring to, of whom or whose. So just to review, we've identified a relative pronoun, bracketed out our relative clause. We've actually bracketed out our relative clause. Now, we've identified our antecedent and how we're going to translate the relative pronoun. And so we've done all that we need to do with that relative pronoun, and we can translate this sentence into English. When translating this into English, the relative clause will come immediately after you translate the antecedent, just so there's no confusion as to what it agrees to, or what the antecedent is for what relative pronoun, as we saw with these sentences earlier going from English into Latin. So this will be translated into English as soon the slaves of whom or whose master was absent will flee to the city of Rome. So now we can move into this next example. This example sentence reads, alii cives regem ex urbe expellere valuerunt qui vir scolestus erat. And so we're going to follow the exact same steps that we just followed. We're going to first identify our relative pronoun and then bracket out our relative clause, which is everything from the relative pronoun to the first verb you meet after the relative pronoun. So here it's everything from qui to erat. The next thing we want to do is we want to find our antecedent by looking at the gender and number of the relative pronoun. Qui is qui is masculine. Here we have the relative clause at the end of the sentence. So there's a couple of possible nouns that it could be. There's a total of 3 that it could possibly be. So let's take a look at these 3 nouns, cives, regem, and urbe, and see which one of them, or which any of them, if any, are not masculine so that we can eliminate them. And lucky for us, urbe is indeed feminine. Therefore, it cannot agree with qui. So urbe will definitely not be our antecedent, which leaves us with cives and regem. And qui is a bit of an ambiguous form. It can either be singular or plural. So it could be either of them, just based off of gender and number alone. But now, to figure out what it could be, we have to sort of broaden our search. So the first place that we want to look is take a look at this relative clause. We see erant, so we should immediately think that, okay, there's going to be some subject and there's going to be some predicate. We're going to be complementing something with a linking verb. So vir scelestus, that is going to be our complement. That's going to be our predicate. And as we notice, vir scelestus is singular, and so is the verb. Erant is singular, and the verb has to agree with the relative pronoun in person and number. So since the verb is singular, we know the relative pronoun, which is the subject of the sentence. I'm going to spoil that, that's the subject of the sentence. Even if it weren't the subject, it would have to be the predicate, in which case it would also have to be singular, because if it's predicate, you're saying that something is equal to something. In this case, in that case, the form of sum esse acts like an equal sign. So the two things have to be equal. But I digress. We have determined that the subject has to be regem because cives is plural, regem is singular. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that cives and regem were both plural, because I think that would make the most sense, and the rest of the sentence was adjusted accordingly to account for that. So viri scelesti erant would be the rest of the relative clause. If we couldn't use the rest of the relative clause to find the antecedent, then what we would do is we would have to take a look at context with the rest of the sentence. So to do that, we would have to take a look at the independent clause. So just looking at the independent clause alone, considering that we have changed the sentence from what is currently on there to alii cives reges ex urbe expellere valuerunt, this sentence would be some citizens wanted to drive the kings out of the city. So we take a look at that, and then we would take a look at our new hypothetical relative clause, qui viri scelesti erant. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. I guess it could make sense for the citizens because they're wicked. They wanted to drive the kings out of Rome. But on the other hand, it makes a lot more sense, and it makes sense with the flow of the sentence for qui viri scelesti erant to agree with kings, because why else would citizens want to expel a king from a city? Because why they would want to expel kings from a city? Because they were wicked men. When I wrote this sentence, I specifically had Tarquinius Superbus in mind, who some citizens wanted to expel him out of the city because he was a wicked man. And so sometimes just situational context, and sometimes when you're reading Latin, historical context will help you if all else fails. Context is your friend. But luckily, we didn't have to get to that. And we were able to look at the rest of the relative clause to see that, okay, qui is actually going to be singular here, so we have to look for a noun that is also singular, in which case regem fits that description. So just x'd out that arrow to cives, and we have drew a line under regem, identifying that as our antecedent. So we've identified our relative pronoun. We have bracketed out our relative clause. We've identified our antecedent using the relative clause in this case because there were some ambiguous forms. So now let's take a look at the case of the relative pronoun. The case here is nominative, so I can translate this as who, what, or that. So there's not a whole lot that has to be done with that, but we just have set that translation off to the side so we know what it will be. Now, we have done everything we can with this relative clause. We know that we have to translate it right after we translate it regem, because we have to translate the relative clause right after the antecedent. So, translating the sentence into English, it would be, some citizens wanted to drive the king, who was a wicked man, out of the city. To recap the video, insofar, we have defined what a relative pronoun is, we have given the forms of said relative pronoun, and we've also given practice sentences going from English to Latin and from Latin to English on how to attack it when you see a relative pronoun in a sentence. Before I cut everyone loose into practice sentences, there are two more things, just grammatical, technical things about relative pronouns that I wanted to go over. The first thing is like some other pronouns, in an ablative of accompaniment, the cum is tacked on to the end of the relative pronoun as opposed to before it. So if you take a look at this sentence, mei amici, quibus cum ad forum ivi sunt sapientes, my friends with whom I went to the forum are wise, with whom, as an ablative of accompaniment, but as opposed to cum quibus, we have it quibus cum. The cum is just moved and tacked on to the end to have that be all one word. The second grammatical thing, this is a bit intuitive, but it's very easy to forget. If the relative pronoun is the object of a verb that takes a case other than the accusative for the direct object, then the relative pronoun will be in that case. So let's take a look at this sentence to clear up what exactly I mean by that. Meus amicus cui appropinquaveram ad forum ire voluit. Appropinquo takes the dative. As such, the direct object will not be in the accusative, it will be in the dative. So when we translate into this and look at it in English, my friend, whom I had approached, wanted to go to the forum, whom is the direct object. So whom has to be in the dative case, which is why in Latin it is cui as opposed to something like quem or quam. So those are the main two rules. It's quibus cum or quacum or quocum for ablative accompaniment, and make sure that if it's a direct object and the verb does something wacky like take a dative or take an ablative or take a genitive, that the relative pronoun is in the correct case accordingly. So with all of that being said, let's start some practice sentences. So for these, they're just going to be straight forms. For the pronoun qui, quae, quod, give the forms that I say. Take a second, pause the video, and try and figure these out. Alright, so I'm going to show all the answers at once, because these are just forms questions. In 3, 2, 1, there are all the answers. Just to sort of talk about how we get to them. First one, masculine, dative, singular. Dative, singular, the only form is cui, so masculine, feminine, or neuter. Those three are all the same, so cui is your answer there. Neuter, accusative, plural. If you forgot this one, remember that the feminine singular nominative and the neuter plural nominative, they are the same form. So both of those will be quae. And also remember neuter rule that the nominative and the accusative, they'll both be the same. So that's how we get to quae. Feminine ablative singular, that is qua. Feminine, there's a lot of A's in there. And also the ablative singular is just one long letter after the QU. For masculine and neuter, it's both O's. In feminine, it's a long A. So quo, qua, quo for those, for masculine, feminine, and neuter. Masculine dative plural form. For qui, quae, quod, it's not like quis, it's quibus. And it will be quibus for all genders in the dative plural and all genders in the ablative plural. And then feminine genitive plural, it looks like a first declension genitive plural ending. It's just QU plus arum. For masculine and For masculine and neuter, it'll both be quorum. So now we move on to the next couple of sentences. Dux orationes quibus cui non crediterunt, and I know it says fake it here, but I pretend that it is habuit as opposed to fake it. I will make that edit in the description. And then the second sentence, the slaves worked energetically in the fields, which were hot today. So take a second, pause the video, and try and translate these guys out. All right, let's take a look at this first sentence. I'm not going to go as in depth into these as I did the other four. I'm just going to sort of hit the highlights and run from there. So first thing that we want to do, identify the relative pronoun, cui, bracket out the relative clause, everything between cui and the first verb after that, so everything between cui and crediterunt. So down is your relative clause. Next thing you want to do, look for your antecedent. Remember, it's gender number, not case. So if you said that cui went with quibus because they will both be in the dative, that is incorrect, because quibus is plural, cui is clearly singular, so they can't go together, even though they have the same case. Remember, relative pronouns don't care about the case. So the only noun that comes before the relative pronoun that fits the masculine, feminine, and neuter, and the number of singular is dux. So we know that cui non crediterunt has to go with dux. And so we've identified a relative pronoun, a relative clause, and our antecedents. It's cui, but credo takes the dative. So this is just a direct object. And then the last thing, I thought when I wrote this that the idiom that to deliver speech was orationem facere. It is not. It is orationem habere. So that is a mea culpa. So that should be habuit, as I mentioned, as opposed to fake it. But since I was still trying to get to that idiom, the actual translation of the sentence won't change, just that one Latin word. So I've gotten the relative pronoun, the relative clause, the antecedent. So now I just have to translate it, inserting the relative clause immediately after the antecedent. So this would be translated into English as the leader, whom they did not trust, delivered speeches to the citizens. So that's how you translate that one. Moving into the next sentence. The slaves worked energetically in the fields, which were hot today. So we found a relative pronoun. Let's split the independent and dependent clauses. We know that our antecedent is going to be in the fields. We take a look at field. The word for field is agere. Agere is masculine. In the fields is plural. So we know gender number, masculine and plural. And which were hot today. The fields were hot today. The fields would be the subject. So since it's the subject of the relative clause, therefore it is in the nominative case. And so we're looking for the masculine plural nominative form of qui quae quod, which is just qui. And we have that, and then we can sort of insert the relative clause wherever we want, either at the end of the sentence or immediately following the relative clause, or really wherever, as long as it's after the antecedent. But, oh well. We're going to, for this one, I put it all the way at the end. So this would be translated into Latin as servi in agris strenue laboraverunt qui erant calidi hodie. Moving on to the next set of two. Take a look at these two sentences. Speculum quod anculae in terra possuerant magna cum sonatu fregit, and the mother called the boys with whom Marcus was playing to return to the house. Here is a hint, quod does not mean because. I will just say that. So take all the time that you need to, pause the video, and try and work these two sentences out. Alright, so now we're going to go over this first one. As I sort of hit on, there are a lot of words in Latin that are ambiguous and mean many different things. As Latin 2 students, you've learned that cum means with. You've also probably heard of temporal cums, so cum meaning when. When you get a little bit later into Latin 2, or maybe the very beginning of Latin 3, you will learn that cum means all sorts of different things. It can mean because, since, although. Context will be your best friend here. A lot of times, when it's in the middle of a sentence like this, it's most likely going to be a relative clause. But just take a look at what makes the most sense. Does it make sense to have because here, or does it make sense to have which or that or whom or whatever? Now, there will be some times where it's ambiguous, and if it's ambiguous, then, and you can make a case for it, then do what your heart desires, is what I will say. But now I'll get into the exact sentence. When I wrote this, my intention was that quod was the relative pronoun. And what I said earlier, quod does not mean because here, so quod has to be the relative pronoun. The relative clause is everything from the relative pronoun to the first verb, so quod to possuerant, so I bracketed that off. We're looking for the antecedent. The gender is neuter, and that's really all we need to look at because there's no nouns other than speculum before quod. So speculum is going to be our antecedent. It's the only neuter noun in the sentence anywhere. So even if I did some weird Caesarian thing and it said that, oh yeah, the antecedents wait at the end, speculum is the only neuter noun, so it's the only thing that it can agree with. If we're looking at quod, we can translate it as which or that, because since it's neuter, it's probably referring to an inanimate object. And which or that is an acceptable translation for both nominative and accusative, so we don't have to worry about any of the ambiguities there. It can be either, but we don't care. We'll see that it is accusative based on the rest of the sentence, but right now we can just translate it as which or that, and that's all we need to know. So this sentence would be translated into English as, the mirror which the slave women had placed on the ground broke with a great noise. Yeah, so that's how you translate that. The magna cum sonditu is a good old ablative of manner. Just threw that in there to spice things up. Now we get into the last sentence. The mother called the boys with whom Marcus was playing to return to the house. So, looking for that relative pronoun, we see it in the with whom. That's a relative pronoun. Underline it. Let's break off. Since here it's in the middle of a sentence, or it's always really been in the middle of a sentence, we can't perfectly say that everything to the left is the independent and everything to the right is the relative clause. We still do have to keep in mind that the commas sort of break out this relative clause for us. So we know that the relative clause is everything within those two commas, and everything outside of those two commas, that's the independent clause. That's the rest of the sentence. And so antecedent is right after, is right before the relative pronoun. That's the boys. Boy in Latin is puer. Puer is masculine. Number of the boys, there seem to be plural boys. So we need a form of the relative pronoun that is masculine and plural. Now looking at with whom. With whom is a classic ablative translation. It is justified because if we want the reason for this, or the use of the ablative case, this would be ablative of accompaniment, and that makes sense. So we need to find the masculine plural ablative form of qui quae quod, and that is quibus. Now, since it's the ablative of accompaniment, we have to do one extra step. We have to add cum to the end of it because it's not cum quibus, it's quibus cum. So your full form here is quibus cum. And then from there, you can translate the rest of the sentence into Latin as mater pueros quibus cum Marcus ludebat. And then for to the house, you can either do domum ad vilam or ad casam redire vocat. You cannot do ad domum because domum is weird, and technically it does this weird place to which thing that you will learn later. but just know that if you want to say to the house, you can just say domum, and you do not need a preposition. So that's all the practice sentences. I'm sure you all did great on that. And I'm going to wrap up this video with this in closing. So, in closing, relative pronouns are words like who, whom, whose, that, or which that can join together two sentences which talk about the same thing. Relative pronouns are different than adjectives in that relative pronouns, when I wrote this, I still thought that the definition was, oh, they agree. No, the relative pronouns act as a flag. They are placeholders for the noun. So you could replace the relative pronoun with the noun itself, but you don't need to do that, otherwise they'd have to be two separate sentences. The relative pronoun is just a flag. It's just saying, hey, we're referring back to something else. And you know what that is the antecedent. But when you translate into Latin, the relative pronoun will retain two of the three main properties of that noun. It will retain the gender and the number. The relative pronoun will not retain the case of the antecedent. It just will not. If the two are the same, then it is by accident. Gender, or not by accident, it's just by chance, I should say. Gender and number will always be the same. Case is not preserved onto the relative pronoun. Now, just to refamiliarize ourselves with some of the terms, a relative clause is a type of dependent clause that contains the relative pronoun. So it is everything in between the relative pronoun and the first noun after the relative pronoun. The antecedent is the noun from which the relative pronoun inherits its gender and number, and it is also the noun that it is referring back to. Think of the relative pronoun as a flag with the noun on the flag banner itself. So if you look at the flag, you can see the noun itself on there, but it's not actually there. If the pronoun is being used in an ablative of accompaniment, you add the cum to the end of the relative pronoun, as we saw several times with quibuscum, and be mindful of the case the verb takes for a direct object. So like apropinquo, credo, noceo, those all take the dative. So you will never see quem, quam, or quod in the accusative because they're all in the dative. If it's something that takes the ablative, like careo, it will be ablative for the direct object. If it's something that takes the genitive, like memone or obliviscor, then it will be genitive for the direct object. So just be mindful of the case that the verb takes for the direct object. If it's good old amo, woco, ambulo, curo, facio, whatever, that does actually take the accusative, then it will be in the accusative. And lastly, here are the forms of qui, qui, quod. In the nominative singular, it's qui, qui, quod. In the genitive, cuius, all three forms. Dative, cui, all three forms. Accusative is quem, quam, quod. Remember, nominative and accusative in the neuter are the same. Ablative is quo, qua, quo. For plural, qui, qui, qui. Remember, neuter, plural, nominative, and feminine, singular, nominative, those two forms will be the same, and that also works for haec, ille, isea, id, other demonstrative pronouns, or other demonstrative adjectives and other pronouns. The genitive plural is quorum, quorum, quorum. Dative is quibus, all three forms, and that will be mirrored in the ablative. The accusative is quos, quas, qui. Remember, nominative and accusative in the neuter are the same. And then ablative is quibus in all three forms. You have made it to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.